First, let's do a Pledge of Allegiance. Please take your hats off and join me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Okay. This meeting is conducted in accordance with authorizations and requirements contained in Governor Newsom's Executive Order N2920, signed March 17th, 2020. Board and staff, please mute all your devices until you are ready to speak and to avoid feedback, echoing, and background noise. Make sure you unmute when speaking and remute when you're done speaking. All board members, please turn on your cameras during the meeting. Staff, please turn on your cameras when speaking and turn them off when you are done speaking. Board members will be advised to use the raise hand feature in Zoom when action and discussion items are presented. I will call on each of you when it is your turn to speak. The public may comment. There's better. The public may comment on items covered on the agenda during item 1.3, or may do so at each time an item is considered, but they will be limited to 3 minutes per comment. To participate in public comment from your computer, tablet, or smartphone, when I announce the agenda item you wish to speak on, click the raise hand feature in Zoom. You will be notified when it is your turn to speak. Please unmute when requested. Please do not turn on your camera unless you are speaking during public comment, and then please turn off when you have completed your comments. To participate in public comment via phone, when I announce the agenda item you wish to speak on, hit *9 to raise your hand. Phone participants will be called on by the last 2 digits of their phone number. When it is your turn to speak, dial *6 to unmute. When you are finished with your public comment, staff will remute you. Please be familiar with the last 2 digits of your phone number. Probably something you're not used to calling. We will follow the following procedure for approving items and taking public comments. I will introduce each agenda item. I will ask for questions from board members. Please raise your hand. I will then call for public comments. The board may then ask additional questions and discuss further if necessary, including public comments if desired. Once concluded, I will ask for a motion and a second. After any further discussion, the board secretary will call for a roll call vote. Any PowerPoints that will be shown today at today's meeting can be viewed on the SCV GSA website tomorrow. And now I'm going to hand it over to Uni, who will call for the roll call attendance.
Thank you. When I call your name, please respond by saying present. Director Biden, are you present?
Present.
Director Cooper, are you present?
Present.
Director Gibbs, are you present? Director Gibbs? Okay, I'll come back to Director Gibbs. Director Goodside, are you present?
Present.
Director Martin, are you present?
Present.
Vice President Natoli, are you present?
Present.
President Atkins, are you present?
Present.
Director Gibbs, are you present? I think he said he was going to be a little late, so I will look out for him. Back to you, President
Okay.
Atkins.
Do you have the ability to text him?
I do. His assistant has informed me that he's going to be joining us from another meeting as soon as he can.
Excellent, thank you. Okay. All right, so now continue with the meeting. Following the guidelines above. Ready? Item 1.3, we already called to order and Pledge of Allegiance. Now I'm opening it to public comment for items not on the agenda. Are there any public comments?
It does not appear there's any public comment at this time.
Thank you. Item 1.4, approval of agenda. You have the agenda before you. Do I have a motion to approve this agenda?
Martin motion to approve.
And a Natoli second. So Martin moved and Natoli seconded. Do you have that, Uni?
Yes, I do.
Any discussion? Further board discussion? Any public comment?
There's no public comment.
Thank you. All those in favor? I take the roll, please, Uni.
Director Biden, your vote.
Aye.
Director Cooper, your vote.
Aye.
Director Gibbs, your vote. Okay, he still has not joined us. Director Gutzeit, your vote.
Yes.
Director Martin, your vote.
Aye.
Vice President Natoli, your vote.
Aye.
President Atkins, your vote.
Aye.
Thank you. The meeting agenda has passed.
Okay, good. For those of you and members of the public that are on the call, we have a quorum, so we're going to proceed with business and move on to item 2, the consent calendar. I'll entertain a motion to approve the consent calendar.
So moved, Gutzeit?
Natoli second.
You have that, Uni?
I do. Thank you.
Any
Discussion.
further comment? Any
Yes.
discussion on? Go ahead.
I'm sorry, Mr. President. Thank you. This is Vice President Natoli. Item 4, the bottom of page 2, I believe. It refers to Bouquet Canyon Reservoir as being part of LA County DWP. I believe that should be the City of Los Angeles DWP.
Huh.
Mr. Cole?
Yeah,
Mr. Cole, are
yes,
you on
that's
the call?
correct. That's correct. We can make that edit. Thank you,
Okay.
Vice President Natoli.
Sorry, I just needed to confirm, Mr. Tolley. That's all.
Absolutely.
Nice catch. Thank you.
I don't know everything.
Okay, and that's the reason I was checking with Mr. Cole, because he's
Absolutely.
expected to know.
That's right.
Okay, so with that change, we have a motion and a second. Any further board discussion?
No.
Any public comment?
There is no public comment at this time.
Thank you. Please take the roll.
Director Biden, your vote.
Aye.
Was that a yes?
Yes.
Thank you. Director Cooper, your vote.
Yes.
Director Gutzeit, your vote.
Yes.
Director Martin, your vote.
Yes.
President Atkins, your vote.
Yes.
Vice President Natoli, your vote.
Aye.
Thank you very much.
So we approve the minutes. Thank you. Well, let's see. Yes, that was the only item in the consent calendar, as I recall. All right, so we move on to 3.1, overview of the SCV GSA groundwater sustainability plan, public workshop held on November 4th, 2020. That goes to Tara. Am I right? Yeah, Tara Bravo.
Hi, I am about to share my screen. So thank you very much, President Atkins and the rest of the board. I am happy to present to you today not just what was in the board memo, which was kind of the results of the public workshop, but also the discussion we had at the meeting yesterday. So there's a little bit of an update to what you've seen, and I'm excited to share that with you. So really quickly, meeting at a glance. I know this is a slide you've seen many, many times. Things to note are that we did not receive much feedback or questions, and we received 0 forms. So this was and we only had 51 instead of like kind of the 60 that we've been seeing. So this was a less attended, public workshop. And I think part of that is because many people who often come to the public workshop had attended some of the stakeholder advisory committee meetings prior. And I noticed that those people were not at this one. Like Ruby didn't come to the public workshop, but she did come to some of the stakeholder advisory committee meetings about this topic previously to that. So reviewing one of the things that we highlighted in this last committee meeting was the appropriate time and places for what kind of feedback. So really getting into the idea that general statements, and this piece of slide, the top part of the slide, we've seen many times because every time I go over kind of how the team addresses feedback. The new pieces of this slide are that the GSP will be updated and refined as new information becomes available. I feel like that has somehow gotten lost along the way. So Rick and I decided that we really needed to highlight the fact that as new data comes in, we will be updating the presentation. And then Jeff made mention that every 5 years, there's actually a built-in update so that we ensure that whatever we put into that plan is accurate and involves the latest data. We also then discussed the meeting series purpose, which I know you guys are very familiar with, which is that we have the stakeholder advisory committee to review the public workshop materials. We then change those materials prior to the public workshop. And then afterwards, we have a debrief with the stakeholder advisory committee, hearing all the public feedback and then advising us on anything we hit or missed on the public workshop. This is typically at the end, but I'm going to break it down this time instead of summarizing. So we had these following workshop questions and feedback, but breaking it down is the presentation feedback. And this was during our committee meetings. I recall these levels were set too low. I do not see any changes reflected here, or at least no changes were made. Are we going to be told again what is happening, or will our concerns be given any consideration? And this was the discussion that we had at the meeting yesterday, which is when we're talking about feedback on presentation pieces, in order to ensure that we hear the public and the public's opinion on the actual topic at hand, we want to make sure that this piece is done at the debriefing meeting where we can go, okay, that I see your point. We can have a conversation about it so that we're not distracting from the public opinion on trigger levels. However, any sort of feedback on the thresholds or the trigger levels is obviously appropriate at any meeting. So just really getting into the kinds of feedback that's distracting from the public opinion versus the kind of feedback that is not. And we dug into that a little bit more at the stakeholder advisory committee meeting so that we could make sure that every voice is heard and not just the committees. So, and then we did another thing with Rick where Rick actually addressed each of the, and we're not gonna do that today, but he actually went through each of the comments that were made at the public workshop by the stakeholder advisory committee and responded very specifically to each one of those items. So just as a recap of both the feedback and then again, how we address that feedback. And that's my whole presentation today. So Maria, I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I just wanted to see how Rick's comments were received. I assume you mean he commented at the meeting that was just yesterday.
Yes.
Did people feel like they had been heard and had a better understanding after his feedback? Or
So, though I can't speak directly for them, we definitely went over line by line every single comment and he responded very directly to each comment. So I can't speak to their emotional state because otherwise I don't want to get into speaking for them, and that's a very sensitive piece. But we absolutely addressed very clearly. There's that first workshop slide. So I'm actually going to share my screen again. We went line by line and we read the question and then we said, this is how we addressed it, or this is what we're doing, or this is why we didn't change. So each one of these was addressed very specifically in that meeting, since these are all stakeholder advisory committee comments.
okay, and then just a quick follow-up, do these become the FAQs then? Like, is there also a written response to these?
So because we will be doing a threshold frequently asked question, like what are thresholds and how are we applying them and how are we dealing with them? We'll be doing that, but to do like the idea that whether or not we're listening to feedback, that will not be an FAQ.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Questions from the board? Any public comment, Uni?
It does not appear to be any. Oh, hold on. There is one.
Okay,
Hi, this is Stacy. I'm sure you can probably hear me. I just wanted to say that while some of the concerns were addressed yesterday by Rick, there are still others that we are going to continue to disagree or agree to disagree on, and that is the appropriateness of the questions. I feel like if there's a question, whether it's during the advisory committee meeting or if it's during the public meeting, that the questions should be addressed. And I'm also now concerned that not all of them are going to be included in the total package. And Tara, maybe you can help me understand. Did you, I thought I heard you say that those questions were not going to be included in the FAQ. Is that,
So,
did you
so
say that?
there's an FAQ that's online.
Okay, you can
That's
pause my
just
time.
like, sorry, what?
Oh, nothing. They're just eating into my 3 minutes, so I
Oh,
get 15
sorry,
seconds
I'll
back.
wait until
No,
you're
that's
done.
okay. That's okay. As long as they give me my time back at 2:15, that's fine.
Okay, so just very briefly, so there's an FAQ series that's just like about the stuff, and that's the FAQ series that board member Goots I believe was referring to, not the record of comments and posts. So as everything that we've talked about, everything will be included in the record. Like in this board
Okay.
meeting.
Oh, okay.
It's already online. Like anybody could see this. This presentation is online. So it's all
Okay.
public record already.
Okay. Okay. All right. And then the only other thing is, so to answer Director Gutzite's question, yes, most of the concerns were addressed. There's just a couple more concerns that we have about the threshold levels that they're setting at 2016 drought levels, which are concerning because that was the point in which we lost several oaks and we lost some of the GDE was impacted. And so we feel that those levels are a bit low to be setting. We want the threshold to be set just slightly higher than those levels. But I guess it's an ongoing discussion, and we can, as Tara said, it's continually updated. So we'll see what the end result looks like, but we still believe that the levels are too low. And I'm done. So thank you. I didn't need all 2 minutes and 15 seconds.
all right, thank you very much. Any other public comment?
Mr. President, may I make a comment?
Yes, sir.
The clock on public comments continues to run if there's a dialogue between the speaker and anybody else. So what I would suggest for those who wish to respond to a public comment, let them get their comment out, and then you don't have to worry about the clock expiring, and then respond to whatever you want to respond to.
Yes, so in the future, what we're going to do is we'll start the clock and we're going to let the public speaker, the public commenter, make their comment completely. And then if staff chooses to answer, they'll do that separately, but we're not going to engage in discourse like that. We're going to take the comment and respond accordingly later, okay? To make it clear for future.
All right, thank you.
Okay, 3.2, that was just informational. So now on to 3.2, and that's Mr. Rick Vergoots. You're up, sir.
Thank you, President Atkins. I just need a moment to share my screen here. Okay, are you able to see the presentation?
Not yet.
Not yet? Okay.
By the way, this is a discussion on sustainable management criteria development. Go ahead, Mr. Vergutz.
Thank you.
Can't see it yet.
Okay.
There we go. Got it.
Okay, good. All right.
You can
Hang
bring
on
it out as a
here. Yeah,
presentation.
let me bring this up here. Okay. So we have a presentation today. You're going to hear from both Jeff and I on this. I'm going to spend a little bit of time in the beginning talking about where we've been, where we're going, and I'll interject some thoughts as we go through related to public comment and some of the things that we've heard, decisions we've made, and in other cases where we've heard things but not changed things. So let me jump in, and Jeff Berry is here with us too. So these are the topics. We will review the process. We'll talk about what we've learned, briefly talk about the purpose of the criteria, review process, and then we're going to talk about input, both from stakeholders and the draft input from the peer review panel. And then we will go in and we will provide a summary of each of the proposed sustainable management criteria for each sustainability indicator. Not shown on this slide, but when we get to our conclusions, we'll open it up for board input. And we can discuss that. And obviously, if you have something to say in the intervening period, of course, you'll do that. So, so this is the path towards a completed GSP. You've seen this before, and we have, starting at the bottom, we started stakeholder engagement some time ago. We've had a lot of information put forward on the basin setting, hydrogeologic conceptual model, water budget, and other technical documents that have been provided to stakeholders. We're currently in the planning phase where we're establishing the sustainable management criteria. This is probably the heavy lift for GSPs. Not probably, this is the heaviest lift for GSPs because it's very complicated and it's interrelated with other factors. After we complete the draft on sustainable management criteria, we're going to move into projects and management actions. Then we're going to talk about monitoring, and we are scheduled to release the draft groundwater sustainability plan in August, this coming August. And then we'll move on towards finalizing it and beginning the annual monitoring. We have developed a proposed sustainability goal with input from the Stakeholder Advisory Committee. You can take a moment and read it, and then I'll give you a little input on the feedback so far. So the proposed goal is something that we think captures the key points for local groundwater sustainability, but we've had some good comment from the Stakeholder Advisory Committee. Some of it is, nothing wrong with it, but it's awfully general. Maybe we could include some more locally unique information and talk more about some of the things we hold in such high regard here. And so that's been feedback from the Stakeholder Advisory Committee. And so we're going to pick this up again after we complete our projects and management actions. Next step, we're going to pick this up again, but of course, happy to discuss this with your board today too. Ultimately, the things that we're sharing with your board today will come back to you as modified for review and ultimately approval with the draft GSP. So this is the proposed goal, and we've had some feedback on it. We've learned a bunch. We haven't seen undesirable results for any of the sustainability indicators thus far. Groundwater levels in the basin, they're variable, like a lot of groundwater basins. They go up and down. In wet periods, they cumulatively rise. In droughts, they will drop from one year to the next until the trend recovers, but they're stable over the long term. That's really important. A lot of basins in California can't say that. We have a water budget analysis, and it indicates we've got sufficient recharge to balance pumping. We know about the water quality issues, perchlorate, PFAS. State regulatory agencies have a very rigid regulatory structure that is in place over this basin that assesses investigations and cleanup. But the municipal agencies, SCV Water, has really worked hard to keep ahead of this stuff and get treatment systems in place without waiting for longer term regulatory solutions. The river habitat, it's supported by groundwater. In some locations, it's been resilient through historic droughts. We did have a big drought in 15-16. We did have some die off of vegetation, and we've had recovery. Avoiding undesirable results to groundwater dependent ecosystems is critical. It's very important to stakeholders, and it's important to us too. We don't know of surface water diversions in the river. There's more water in the river now than there used to be in the past as a result of urbanization. And groundwater elevations in the Piru Basin are also higher now as a result of urbanization. We've learned a ton, and this is just kind of the high points. Let's talk about the purpose of the criteria. The criteria is designed to allow us to maintain or improve groundwater basin sustainability. You'll hear a lot of times that to get to sustainability, you have to just avoid undesirable results, and that's true. But it's not just about avoiding, it's maintaining. It provides criteria and thresholds for evaluating sustainability, and we look at factors that could put sustainability in risk. This is a diagram showing how the sustainable management criteria is developed. Item 1, we've hit that hard with technical reports. Item 2, developing the goals, identifying the undesirable results, and item 4, looking at minimum thresholds, and item 5, measurable objectives are a large part of what we're doing with the sustainable management criteria. You'll see at the end, there's a box called projects and management actions. That's where we're going next. And what that is it's a discussion with stakeholders and your board on the kinds of things that might be needed to maintain or improve sustainability in the long run. And depending on what those items may be, that can cause some iterative changes in the criteria. We won't know until we get there, but we are recommending a special meeting with your board in June to talk about projects and management actions. Public input, we've had a ton. And right now we're just talking about the 5 meetings on sustainable management criteria. Excuse me, I'm going to close a window here. We've had one public workshop, March 10th, on the sustainable management criteria. As Tara described, we're recording and following up with public input. I prepared some tables in the following slides where we're looking at the most common public input, and we'll review that as we go forward. We've put this table together based on review of all the meetings we've had on the sustainable management criteria, and this is the most common public input. Might there be something that isn't included in here? It's possible. We're not including things like minor clarifications or questions about graphics, but these are the key things. You can take a minute and just look at these. And as I go through these slides with Jeff today, we're going to be highlighting these. What you'll see in subsequent slide todays for the 5 criteria is I will show these dark blue boxes, and you're going to see other boxes that are a lighter color. The dark blue ones are the most common for this sustainable management criteria. The lighter blue, not so much. So you'll see that. You'll get the hang of that pretty quick here. We're also getting input from a groundwater model expert review panel. We had a question at a meeting who they are. This is who they are. We've got Jacobs Engineering, Nate Brown, Dr. Jason Sun with United, Jim Rumbaugh with Environmental Simulations. This is an A team. These are groundwater modelers with a lot of experience, and it's great to have them on the peer review team. They've also reviewed our water budget and model documentation report, and most recently they've looked at the draft sustainable management criteria. They've given us some feedback on the draft criteria. Key thing is they think we're on the right track, but they do have some recommendations. They'd like to see us augment the sustainable management criteria for depletion of interconnected surface water to address future conditions. I think we're going to do that. Jeff will talk about it. We're looking at using groundwater wells as a surrogate for surface water flow. That's allowed and even specifically mentioned in the regulations. And by doing that, that'll make it a little bit easier for the Department of Water Resources to review that criteria. And doing that doesn't affect what we're already doing regarding the GDEs. They've made other recommendations for small adjustments. Some good comments on monitoring and how long water levels would need to be at certain points before it's considered a potential undesirable result, and certain language revisions. So great input so far. It's in draft form, but it will be finalized. Okay, moving on. Today's presentation. So this is the format of how we're going to walk your board and the members of the public through this today. We're going to talk about each of the 6 sustainability indicators on this leftmost column. And then we're going to talk about stakeholder input first. And then we'll talk about undesirable results, minimum thresholds, measurable objectives. Seawater intrusion is not a factor in this basin, so we won't be discussing it, but we list it here just for completeness. Okay, now moving into some of the more technical material. Now I'm going to jump to one of those slides where I can summarize the public comment, and then after that, Jeff will go into the technical makeup of the proposed criteria. So this is the most common public input regarding groundwater level decline. You'll see comments here: East End recharge, projects and management actions. Let me just talk through it a little bit. So what we know with the basin is that we don't have chronic overdraft. We know water levels go up, they go down. During drought, they go down a little farther. During wet periods, they recover. We also know that during extended drought, we can have some plant die-off, such as oak trees or cottonwoods. Sandra Cattell, one of the members, brought up oaks in Placerita Canyon. Stacy has brought up cottonwoods, and we've talked to the stakeholders about this. You know, drought-caused die-off is something that happens in the watershed, largely in the margins of the basin, and that's just because of the physical nature of the basin. We've got areas that are up higher, steeper, where groundwater levels are more prone to, or where groundwater tends to drain out faster from the tributary canyons, sometimes causing drought stress or occasion die-off to vegetation. Those kinds of things, that type of drought stress is not something that the GSP is required to address. But there have been some comments that suggested maybe that should be looked at. In other words, higher thresholds to better insulate us for drought. We don't think that's necessary simply because we have a sustainable system here. We've talked a lot about GDEs and these trigger levels. Stacy mentioned these. And we'll talk more about these trigger levels down the road here in this presentation. We've talked about monitoring, and I mentioned thresholds. So good input from the stakeholders. And from that, Jeff, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Rick.
You bet.
All right. So what do we mean by undesirable results? You know, this is a key term that EWR expects the basin stakeholders to define. It is essentially, you know, our definition for, in this basin, what are unreasonable or significant effects, and it needs to be related to pumping. So in this case, long-term sustainable groundwater production impacts to those could be, a significant or unreasonable effect of undesirable result. Impacts to other beneficial uses, including groundwater dependent ecosystems or threatened endangered species in the river, is also an undesirable result. So clearly we set these minimum thresholds in a number of places of each of these indicators is saying, okay, if we have, for example, water levels that drop below this certain elevation, we have a potential undesirable result that needs to be evaluated. So again, this is a level that folks in this basin are set. We make recommendations, it's reviewed. And so the point here is that the minimum threshold is essentially the basis for defining one of the definitions of undesirable result. And of course, as Rick mentioned, the criteria may be refined based on monitoring data and analysis in the future GSP updates. Next slide. So for chronic groundwater level decline, that's one of those indicators, and I'm specifically referring to, in this case, that the alluvial aquifer, the shallow sand and gravel that the river and tributaries sit in, anywhere from 100 to 200 feet thick. So an example undesirable result that we've come up with are groundwater elevation levels drop below the minimum thresholds in 25% of the representative wells over a 2-year period. What do I mean by 25% of representative wells? Well, we are developing a network of monitoring locations and specific wells where we have a long history of water level data. We have knowledge of the construction of the well. It represents spatially a good spot for us to evaluate what's happening in that part of the basin. So we've identified a bunch of these representative wells. And right now we're saying we want to look at if 25% or more of those wells have water levels that drop below the minimum threshold, in this case over a 2-year period consecutively, then that's an undesirable result. We're reconsidering whether that should be a 2-year period based on the peer review feedback. It might be 3, which we've set for the Saugus Formation. And that difference basically is so that after 3 years, you can clearly see there's a trend that we need to address with projects or management actions of some kind. The magnitude or rate of decline of the water levels in that aquifer are greater than what we would have expected in future drought conditions. And again, in 25% of our representative wells over a 2-year period is what's in the document now. And then also very important for this indicator is the potential for impacts to GDEs have to be considered. And we're going to talk a lot more about that toward the end of the presentation. Next slide. So what are our thresholds that we want to set? First, the proposed minimum threshold for the alluvial aquifer. We've set this using the groundwater flow model and using predicted future water levels in the year 2042 with full build out of the basin, climate change included, which means there's going to be more evapotranspiration from plants. And it's also going to, I'm not ready to go there yet. It's means also less precipitation. So there's less recharge to the groundwater basin. So we want to set the minimum level at where we think those future predicted water levels are going to be at our representative wells in the alluvium. Now, there's a note here, again, related to groundwater dependent ecosystems, is that we want to be protective of those systems. And so we're going to set thresholds or trigger levels at specific monitoring locations for groundwater dependent ecosystems based on historical low water levels, not some future predicted water level at full build out. We'll talk more about that later. The proposed measurable objective, and what do I mean by measurable objective? That's really just some level above the minimum where we would like to maintain water levels. It's a target that we want to make sure that we can reach in the next 20 years. It creates that from a water level perspective between the minimum threshold and the measurable objective is kind of our operating range for where we want water levels to fluctuate. And that's essentially what the measurable objective is. And it's basically want to make sure that we can provide access to groundwater consistent with the operating plan over historic dry hydrologic periods. So for example, during that period 2006 to 2016, and particularly the drought between 2011 and 2016, we want to make sure that we've got enough water, groundwater in the system to make it through the drought within our operating plan and not drop water levels below the minimum threshold that I'm showing here. Next slide. There we go. So here's an example of a graph, and you can see on the left-hand side is groundwater elevation relative to sea level. Across the bottom is a time scale, and you'll notice that we've got a couple different time scales here. So we've got 2022, which is when the plan is going to be submitted, and then out to 2042, 20-year time frame planning horizon. And what we've done and what we were asked to do by DWR is assume that the historical hydrology, the rainfall patterns, the droughts, wet periods, normal periods are translated forward in time as if they were to repeat out to the year 2042. We also looked at it out to 2072 as required by DWR. And so what you see here are a number of lines, and the ones that I'd like you to focus on are, we've got a blue line at the top, that squiggly line, that's the groundwater level at this well in the alluvium. And it shows that annual fluctuation up and down, up and down. This is between Castaic Creek and the Santa Clara River. The next squiggly line below that purple line, is what we would predict to occur in the future with climate change and with full build out of the aquifer, or of the pumping according to the operating plan. And so based on the groundwater modeling work that we've done, we've set that minimum threshold, or that MT, at where we would predict the lowest water level to be, knowing that the analysis that we've done shows that the water levels are going to recover. So that's why we're okay with setting it at that elevation there. The measurable objective is set at what would be essentially an average water level that we would see through that whole entire hydrologic sequence. So that's essentially the theory behind minimum thresholds, measurable objectives. And we set these at each of our representative wells that we identify for the alluvium in this case, and then I'll show you some examples of the Saugus Formation. Go to the next slide. So moving to the Saugus Formation, which is a major aquifer that supplies water to this basin for irrigation, for drinking water, for a range of uses. So for the Saugus Aquifer, the undesirable result is that groundwater elevations have dropped below the minimum threshold in 3 consecutive years. And then for the alluvial aquifer and the Saugus aquifer together, there's a reduction in groundwater and storage, or the groundwater that's present in the pore spaces in the aquifer, in the rock. when you lower water levels, you're reducing that volume of water that's present in the aquifer. So we want to be able to meet demand over a multi-year drought, just like what we experienced this last 2011, 2016 drought. So that's an undesirable result if we can't do that. Next slide. So what are our thresholds we want to set for the Saugus? For the minimum threshold, or that lowest level, is going to be the lowest predicted groundwater level estimated to occur in each of our representative monitoring sites. And I'll show you a graph that illustrates that. And then the proposed measurable objective is going to be the long-term average future predicted groundwater level, again, at our representative monitoring sites. So if we go to the next slide, this kind of illustrates the point. So just as the other graph that you saw, on the left is groundwater elevation. On the bottom scale is 2022 out to 2042, with the assumption that we've repeated the historical hydrology going forward, plus we've added climate change, plus we've considered full build out of the basin, including full pumping of the Saugus up to 35,000 acre feet per year during certain drought periods. The squiggly line you see, the uppermost line is what at this location at a Saugus observation well that we predict the water level to be, that blue line. You can see that these circles that you see here and more recently are the actual measured water levels. So the groundwater model does a pretty good job of showing us that our predictions are likely to be reasonable. The lower purple line, that squiggly line, is the full build out condition, pumping the Saugus during drought periods at 35,000 acre feet per year. And you can see the water levels are quite a bit lower. We've set the minimum threshold at the lowest predicted water level. Again, we're comfortable with this because we know from the simulation results that there's still enough rainfall that occurs in this basin to recharge that Saugus aquifer, and so that we're not going to end up in a chronic decline situation or chronic reduction in storage. So the measurable objective, again, is picked as the average, where we'd like to kind of maintain water levels over multiple wet and dry periods. And it gives you the feeling for the range of operation that we'd like to work within. Next slide. You take it, Rick.
Thanks, Jeff. So we're going to talk about, we're moving on now to the next sustainable management criteria called chronic reduction in storage. And the blue boxes are, the most common public input that we've heard. We continue to hear about an interest in East End recharge and maybe projects to bring water up into the East End. That's been talked about with the Stakeholder Advisory Committee a couple times. There's some interest to bring water up into the East End for recharge. Another member said, yep, that's a possibility, but the economics would have to be looked at. It could be very expensive, might not be enough bang for the buck. From the GSP team's perspective, we don't see that as a required project at this point, just because of the way the basin operates and that the East End is normally dry. But this is something that some of the Stakeholder Advisory Committee members continue to raise. And high five to them. That's the process that we're doing here. Again, we haven't seen chronic water level decline. Therefore, we're not seeing chronic reduction in storage either. Monitoring is something that has come up in this regard. Where in the alluvial system would we monitor? Where in the Saugus would we monitor? And again, the comments about thresholds have come up. And we haven't changed the thresholds for the first criteria that we showed today, which is depletion or chronic depletion or chronic decline of water levels, because we don't see impacts. And similarly here, we have the same minimum thresholds for this criteria, and we're not recommending changing those at this point. You'll hear about GDEs again. We have a slightly different approach to address low water levels by the GDEs, which you've heard me mention earlier and Jeff just mentioned a minute ago, called trigger levels. So, and Jeff, take it away. And Jeff, just so you know, I'm having a little trouble in audio. I seem to have audio, and then I get about every minute it cuts out for 3 seconds and then it restarts. Not sure what's going on. So,
Bummer.
okay, back to you, Jeff.
All right, thanks. Next slide. So this chronic reduction of groundwater and storage, another indicator that DWR expects us to look at. And the key thing here is that we consider an undesirable result, or something that we don't want to see happen, is that water level declines caused by pumping in 25% of the wells over a 2-year period. And again, this might be extended to 3 years. Reduces the volume of groundwater and storage such that there's insufficient supply to support pumping during an extended drought. That seems to make sense. We want to preserve that volume. It's just like a storage tank. And if we don't have that volume available to us, then that's an undesirable result. It's very much tied to the water level indicator. They're very related. So you're going to see some of the same thresholds that we set for chronic water levels decline related to storage. Just wanted to give you that in advance. Go ahead. So the undesirable result for reduction of groundwater and storage in the Saugus Formation is groundwater elevations have dropped below the minimum threshold for 3 consecutive years. And the minimum threshold is going to be based on the water levels. And again, for the alluvial aquifer and the Saugus Formation together, that reduction in groundwater and storage results in an inability to meet demand during a multi-year drought. Next slide. So what are our thresholds? And I'm going to talk about the alluvial aquifer and the Saugus Formation. The minimum threshold for storage is going to be addressed essentially by the measurable objectives and the minimum thresholds for chronic water level decline. It's going to be roughly the same. I've already mentioned that we need to get through extended drought. For the Saugus Formation, that minimum threshold value is considered an interim value, and simply because we've never pumped the Saugus hard enough to know how much we can pump it for sure. The model shows that we were able to pump according to the operating plan to meet full demand in the basin. Could we pump it more? I think we may be able to. But our thresholds are set at based on the operating plan as it stands right now. And we could evaluate that further in the future if we want to have the Saugus, be able to pump the Saugus at a higher rate or volume to provide resiliency during drought without causing undesirable results. But that's a future evaluation. The measurable objective, or where we'd like to keep the volume and storage, is again addressed by the minimum thresholds and objectives for water level decline. Go ahead. And shift to water quality.
Right, so we're moving on to the next criteria, which is degradation of groundwater quality. Also an important consideration in the basin. I'm sure that you've already connected the dots with concerns about perchlorate and PFAS and VOCs. You know, the sustainability goal, you know, reflects that we want a sustainable system. We did have a question on this about whether or not this criteria related to water quality applies to all pumpers, and it does. And Jeff will go into it a little bit, but the way we've set up the criteria recognizes that the municipal entities, you know, they have been affected by these contaminants, and they've responded by installing treatment. There's already a regulatory structure over the basin regarding groundwater contamination. And so we're not recommending that the groundwater sustainability plan adds yet another layer of something that could be like a regulatory process. We're not really set up to do that. And the state agencies are really running the show here. And so the municipal entities are operating within that criteria. Now for the private well owners, many of them have wells in the upper parts of the watershed away from the contamination that we're seeing in the central part of the basin. So they may not be as susceptible to it. And we've also looked at inorganics, salts. The GSP as written now doesn't create a new structure for salts. We're relying on the existing salt and nutrient management plan in the basin. And Jeff will talk a little bit about that. I list monitoring here because we've also talked about this in context of monitoring. You know, down the road with the GSP monitoring program, we would like to pull in other wells to the extent we have volunteers to do so to help understand spatial distribution of water quality. We had another good question about emerging contaminants, whether or not this proposed criteria would be responsive to emerging contaminants. It would. And the reason it would is that we're using the regulatory agencies with their existing structure to address these things. Okay, Jeff, take it away.
Okay, great. Next slide. Okay, so for groundwater quality, which is obviously very important to everyone, we've listed some undesirable results here. So they include, and some of these are actually suggested by DWR. So water management actions, particularly those that are directed by the GSA, interfere with existing groundwater remediation efforts and create a permanent loss of groundwater supply. So that's an important consideration on any project that GSA may move forward with in the future. Concentrations of regulated contaminants and untreated groundwater from private domestic or agricultural wells exceed regulatory thresholds. That's undesirable. We have a significant and unreasonable loss of municipal groundwater supply due to migration of a contaminant plume and an inability to pump and treat groundwater or reasonably secure an alternative supply. So far, SCV Water's done a really good job of managing this issue. And then lastly here, groundwater pumping strategies cause concentrations of these salts, dissolved minerals in the groundwater, measured by total dissolved solids, the chloride or nitrate and sulfate, exceed the water quality objectives set by the Regional Water Quality Control Board. And then also exceed what are called basin-wide assimilative capacity described in the salt nutrient management plan. That basically means you can't do the assimilative capacity is the limit of how much salt can be added through a recharge project or some other project that could add salt to the groundwater system in certain locations in the basin. That could have an effect basically on if you choose to do, where you do recycled water projects, for example. Next slide. So we've broken down for water quality, we've broken these thresholds down in two categories. One set for contaminants and another set for the salts and nutrients. And again, our responsibility, the GSA's responsibility is to protect all the beneficial uses. So that includes domestic wells and private golf course wells and irrigation wells, in addition to the municipal supply wells. So as Rick mentioned, contaminants including perchlorate, VOCs, PFAS have been detected over many years in the basin, and they predate enactment of SGMA in January of 2015. And the reason that statement is there is because DWR is not expecting GSAs to improve water quality above or beyond what was present when Sigma was enacted. It's a really important point. You're not expected to come up with actions to restore water quality prior to that date. And that's true for any of these actions. The responsibility, as Rick mentioned, for characterization, monitoring, remediation of contamination is being handled by the state Regional Water Quality Control Board and the California Department of Toxic Substances Control and other agencies. It's not the responsibility of the GSA. Now, SCV Water has proactively collaborated with these regulatory agencies. They've monitored the contamination. They've installed wellhead treatment when contaminants are either detected or are approaching regulatory thresholds so that the water they deliver is free of any of these contaminants. So because the GSA has no authority or responsibility for managing the contamination, we've not set any minimum thresholds for the regulated contaminants. Next slide. Now, measurable objectives. Again, this is where we would like to see things being. And DWR basically is saying, hey, don't make anything worse, okay? Don't make things worse since Sigma was enacted. So we want to, for our measurable objective, we want to maintain municipal pumping for beneficial uses consistent with the volumes and quantities that are discussed and described in the Urban Water Management Plan for the wet, normal, dry, multi-dry years. For non-municipal pumping, and that's for agriculture, golf courses, the Pitches Detention Center, Whitaker Burmite, and their contaminant remediation program, and small-scale domestic pumpers. We want them to be able to pump volumes of water and rates that are consistent with, again, what's described in the Urban Water Management Plan for the basin for these different periods. Now, groundwater quality from private wells, our goal is to meet or be better than the basin plan objectives as verified by a groundwater monitoring program. And as Rick mentioned, particularly in some of the outlying areas, we don't have a database of water quality at domestic wells. And so I think that the plan is going to include outreach to private domestic well owners in certain locations to try to see if we can establish a baseline groundwater quality database so that we have some idea if those particular beneficial uses are being impacted at some point in the future. Next slide. Now for salts and nutrients, again, separate category, these dissolved constituents that don't have regulatory standards for health. So we're saying we want those constituents measured in 20% of the wells in each management zone. That's described in the Salt and Nutrient Management Plan. There are management zones throughout the basin. We don't want those to exceed the water quality objectives or the basin-wide similar capacity described in that Salt and Nutrient Management Plan. So those limits are already described. There's a regulatory framework for that. Again, that's not something that the GSA necessarily needs to be managing. Just keeping an eye on. Next. Our measurable objectives for salts and nutrients. Basically, we want to meet or do better than what's in those water quality objectives as described in the Salt and Nutrient Management Plan. Next slide. Let's go ahead, Rick.
Thanks, Jeff. So land subsidence, we've had some questions from this from the stakeholder group. You know, as a matter of background, and I'm sure Jeff will mention it, but we in the Santa Cruz Valley area, we don't have a record of land subsidence. We've reviewed some of the data. We show some minor declines and some minor increases in land elevations. Jeff will talk more about that. Important thing to point out here is we don't have a chronic water level decline that can lead to subsidence. We're still working on the analysis. We recently talked with DWR to get some input on how other basins are looking at this. We've got some data gaps on this issue. Jeff will go into the minimum thresholds. They're pretty straightforward. And with that, Jeff, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, let's go to the next slide. So just so everybody's on the same page, land subsidence happens as a result, most frequently anyway, from dewatering or water that leaves the pore spaces in fine grained units, the clay and silt layers that are present in an aquifer. We see a lot of evidence of that in the Central Valley. There's very thick and laterally extensive clay layers that when you bring the water levels down and you dewater those zones, the water doesn't support the structure of the clay or the fine grain unit any longer. And so you get this collapse in the structure. And that's the concern with subsidence as a result of pumping, if you overpump an aquifer. There's a bunch of factors that go into that in terms of, is that aquifer itself susceptible to subsidence, meaning is there an extensive clay layer or silt layer, and what's the structural support for the aquifer if you do lower water levels? So the undesirable result for this indicator is land surface deformation, differential settlement that causes broken pipelines and damaged roads. And then, again, this is something that's important. Groundwater pumping results in land subsidence greater than the thresholds that are going to be set at 10% of the monitoring locations. I'm not telling you what those thresholds are yet because we're still in the process of evaluating specific data within this basin and specific rates of subsidence that have been seen in the past. But the idea is we don't want to see the subsidence greater than the rate on a per year basis in 10% of the monitoring locations. Otherwise, we get an undesirable result. Let's go to the next slide. So for a minimum threshold, it's going to be based on a geotechnical evaluation that's ongoing for the local soils and geology. And we're going to take a look at not only what data is available to us from satellite imagery, and DWR has provided some data, and the county has a set of benchmarks through the basin that we're looking at. We're also taking into consideration that groundwater levels are going to be lower in the future potentially than what we've observed historically. You saw some of those hydrographs that I presented that showed the predicted future water level was going to be a bit lower. We want to know, does that result in subsidence, and what's the risk? And so the minimum threshold essentially is going to be the maximum amount of subsidence on an annual basis that causes impacts to critical infrastructure. For the measurable objective, we'd love it for no long-term reduction in elevation at monitoring locations. The likelihood of that is relatively low, but we also have seen based on satellite imagery that ground surface has risen in some places as a result of tectonic activity, geologic forces that are acting now. We also know that we have oil and gas development happening at much deeper elevations, and is that causing subsidence now or in the future? And there is a time factor. The subsidence doesn't necessarily happen right away. It can be delayed over a long period of time. So we're going to come up with a monitoring program in all likelihood to allow us to understand whether subsidence is a factor now and in the future in the basin. Next slide. Okay, Rick.
Okay, so this is the last criteria. I mean, technically the last is seawater intrusion, but that doesn't apply. So we'll spend more time on this one. So depletion of interconnected surface water. This has been one of the most talked about criteria with the Stakeholder Advisory Committee. I'm sorry, I've got a very touchy keyboard here. Jeff will go into sort of the way we'd like to monitor, evaluate, and manage depletion of interconnected surface water. Let me take a minute and talk about some of the stakeholder input. Again, we've heard input about East End recharge and projects and management action. There's interest in going above and beyond what the regulations require, in our opinion, in the east end of the basin. But there are economic factors that go into that too. Where the rubber really begins to meet the road on this criteria is with groundwater dependent ecosystems. We have established a series of trigger levels that will allow us to see a decline in groundwater and evaluate it to determine if that decline is caused by pumping and if undesirable results are expected. And if they are, then we'll have time in that process to adapt, possibly move pumping around. We've heard about cottonwood and oaks under this topic too. And in the margins of the basin, upstream from the central part of the basin, we do not have a special GDE monitoring program. Those areas are affected by natural conditions that are a little bit, or that are outside of what a GSP would do. But down lower in the basin, the trigger levels would help evaluate potential impacts to vegetation. Role of pumping is important to understand with this. We've entertained some questions on that yesterday. Jeff can speak more to that today. Good news again, we don't have chronic water level declines in the basin that would really put a strain on these interconnected surface waters. What we see is sections of the basin are stressed during drought and they recover when drought subsides. Jeff will talk about monitoring locations. We've had lots of stakeholder questions on that, as well as thresholds. So I'll turn it over to you, Jeff.
Great, thanks, Rick. Next slide. So some background here on interconnected surface water. First, what is it? It's locations where groundwater is, in our definition, within 30 feet of ground surface somewhere during the year, where plant communities that are normally associated with riparian areas or the river corridor or tributaries, where that groundwater is supporting development of riparian plants and hence the habitat for plants, animals, amphibians to live. Not to mention certain fish, listed fish, unarmored three-spined stickleback, for example. So there are places where that river surface water system is interconnected with groundwater, and those are special locations we're going to talk about. So our goal is to avoid adverse impacts to those ecosystems, including the aquatic species. Now, we've established what Rick called trigger levels that are intended to provide an early warning that we might be approaching an undesirable result or might be approaching an impact to a GDE when water levels fall too low. And when water levels fall too low, if there's no surface water coming in to essentially water the plants, and if the groundwater level is below the root zones, below the river level, or below the riparian areas, then you have a potential to really stress those plants and impact those groundwater dependent ecosystems. We do have also, in addition to maintaining a healthy riparian corridor, we also have some very specific issues or areas where if you reduce surface water because you're pumping and you're causing the surface water to infiltrate and you're losing that flow, there are some places in the river, like for example at the I-5 bridge, where we know there are pools that support the unarmored three-spined stickleback. And so those fish, while they're adapted to those low flows, we obviously cannot dry those areas up. So we've got some special monitoring and some triggers, especially for those areas in order to avoid those, what we call acute impacts to aquatic species. Next slide. So we are trying to develop some criteria to respond to this indicator, knowing that there's a a fairly long section of the river that's very connected to groundwater. And so we're going to be using the groundwater model to predict future flows in the river under future development conditions, under future pumping and climate change, to identify groundwater elevations and surface water flow at those locations. And those groundwater elevations at certain locations will be used as a surrogate for surface water depletion, since we don't have actual gauges, stream gauges in these locations. Frankly, we've only got one stream gauge down at the county line, and there's an old gauge at the Old Road Bridge that we may be able to resurrect to help us in the monitoring. So that's why we're going to be relying on piezometers that are going to be installed in this, what we call GDE area. And we're going to be establishing thresholds within groundwater levels within those wells as surrogate for what the flow in the river ought to be. And I mentioned that additional monitoring within the high priority areas. So go ahead and go to the next slide. So an undesirable result for the depletion of interconnected surface water. Well, it's a permanent loss or significant degradation of the existing native, riparian, or aquatic habitat due to lower groundwater levels caused by pumping. And we've gotten, in fact, we had quite a dialogue yesterday about how do you distinguish pumping effects from drought effects? And it's not an easy topic. It's not easy to sort that out. And I'm happy to spend some time on that if anybody wants to get into it. The second criterion has to do with this acute, temporary but acute loss of aquatic habitat in specific locations that are critical to these sensitive aquatic species due to, again, lower groundwater levels caused by pumping. So those are clear undesirable results from surface water depletion. Next slide. So what are our criteria that we're going to go with? And Rick mentioned these trigger levels. We've set these up to be particularly responsive to protecting and avoiding impacts to the GDEs. In this case, we're setting those levels at the lowest historic low water level within the past 40 years. There was a concern raised by some of the stakeholder members that might not be protective enough, and should we consider some initial trigger level above the historic low, recognizing that, well, in 2016, we did see a loss in certain species of plants, trees in particular, in some locations that we think were mostly due to drought conditions, but also the concern is, well, shouldn't we set some protective levels that are higher than the historic low? That's still being discussed. In our opinion, in the biologist's opinion, we saw that the riparian vegetation, while stressed during the last drought, seems to have recovered with some loss of some plants. That's normal in a dry climate like we have, with intermittent rainfall. So in these sensitive habitat areas that I mentioned near the I-5 bridge, where we have the unarmed three-spine stickleback that I mentioned, we're saying let's set the trigger level, let's set this initial trigger level 2 feet above that historic low, so that we have some time to deal with, to come up with a plan for, first of all, evaluating what's happening, but then also implementing a plan before we ever get to that minimum threshold that we've set, that lowest historical water level. Clearly, that has to be implemented in a very timely manner. The measurable objective, or where we'd like to see water levels, is basically at the average groundwater levels in the alluvial aquifer that don't result in permanent loss of habitat at those monitoring locations within the GDE area. Now, I'll show you some graphics here in a minute of what I'm talking about there, where the monitoring and where the GDE area is. We want to maintain flow in the river where these UTS, or unarmored three-spine stickleback, are present to sustain aquatic habitat. And we'll probably be using groundwater levels measured in piezometers as a surrogate for measuring flow itself in the river. Next slide. So what are we going to do if we reach a trigger? Either we get down to that initial trigger 2 feet above, or we get to our trigger level at the historic low. What are we going to do? We've come up with a list of questions and analysis that needs to be performed. Is the affected river segment supported by surface flow from a WRP discharge already? That's important. If the habitat's already got a source of water to supply it, maybe that takes away some of the criticality of this. Is the historic low groundwater level already below the tree, shrub, root depths? That's a key question also. Will the vegetation or sensitive species survive the temporary loss of access to groundwater? The key is temporary. So the duration that water level stays low is really, really critical. And we're going to gain a lot of knowledge as we implement the monitoring program about the criticality of that duration. Has that management action trigger level been reached often in recent years in that particular reach of the river? And how quickly have water levels recovered? And a key question here is, which is difficult in some cases, are the declines in groundwater levels resulting from pumping or result of drought, or is it a combination? And then lastly, has new information been obtained that can be used to refine the trigger level in the future? So as I mentioned, timely management actions would be implemented. And that could, if we do reach a trigger level or an initial level above that, those management actions could include redistribution of pumping, reducing pumping as necessary to protect the GDEs. And that could even include, reducing the amount of pumping in certain areas and deciding to import more water to offset the reduction in supply to meet demand. So there's a lot of actions that we would consider. Those are going to be developed going forward and going to be discussed with the stakeholder committee and your board going forward to make sure that those actions are appropriate and can be implemented in a timely way. Next slide. So I'd like to just review with you the findings from the work we've done so far on related to GDEs to help kind of broaden your perspective and understanding of what I've been talking about. So what you see is a map showing this in the green area within the center of the basin and up Castaic Creek and San Francisco Canyon. You see the green as areas where we've identified that these groundwater dependent ecosystems exist, these riparian areas. And we've used guidance from the Nature Conservancy on selecting these areas. There's been some field reconnaissance to verify many of these areas. And we've used what we call a 30-foot clip or a cut, where areas that are outside of this area that you see, these green areas that are where groundwater is deeper than 30 feet during any time of the year, are not supported by groundwater. And so we've excluded them from consideration as a GDE. And that's consistent with the TNC guidance on this topic. Next slide. Okay, and I just wanted to give you a picture of a preliminary map of the GDE monitoring locations. Most of these locations are new. We do not have wells in many of these areas. We'd like to use existing wells to the extent we can, but we also recognize that we're probably going to have to install some shallow monitoring wells, within 50 feet deep, to be able to monitor groundwater levels in these areas. And this is just intended to show you areas of interest. Starting on the east end at GDEA well, we've got a well up in the San Francisco Canyon and also in Castaic Creek. We're less concerned about the green area farther to, you can see farther to the south and west toward the basin boundary, because we've seen in that area groundwater upwelling that perennially occurs as a result of the Saugus Formation discharging to that area and creating a pretty constant flow of groundwater to support those plants. So that gives you an idea. We're probably going to end up anywhere from 6 to 9 monitoring locations that are going to be outfitted with automatic water level monitoring devices that will be read on a frequent basis so that we can know if we've got a problem or not, particularly during drought conditions. Next slide. So how do we go about setting these trigger levels that I mentioned before for protection of these groundwater dependent ecosystems? And I'm showing you here a hydrograph, and the blue arrow points to the location where that hydrograph pertains. Again, elevation of groundwater surface on the left. We've got on the bottom axis time, and this is predicted to occur in the future based on future climate conditions. And we've assumed that the historical conditions are translated forward in time. In this case, we've got a predicted historical water level fluctuation that you see here in the blue line. And we've set the minimum threshold at the lowest predicted water level. Actually, it's in this case, it's actually 2 feet above that level. We set this initial trigger because this location actually is at the I-5 bridge. So we're gonna set that level 2 feet above the historical low at this spot. For the measurable objective, it's going to be at roughly, the average predicted water level that we see there. Next slide. This is 2 miles downstream. You see on the map on the left here where this hydrograph occurs. And we see a pretty big fluctuation in water levels, much more so than in the last one. Again, this location is not as sensitive because we don't have aquatic species that we're concerned about, listed species, UTS. So we're setting it at the historic low water level, knowing full well that we may end up seeing water levels that go deeper than this in the future, but we want to be protective of GDE. So this criterion for interconnected surface water is set shallower. Some would argue, and input that we received from the stakeholder committee is that we need to move that red line up higher, because that represents what we saw in 2016, that historic low. And so the question is, should that level be set higher? Should we set an initial trigger above that? That's being considered still. Next slide. So Rick, I'll turn it over to you. Rick, I'm sorry, you're muted.
You're muted.
Thank you. Thanks, Jeff. Thank you, everybody. So we've had good input from the SAC and others in this process. We would like to hold a special meeting with your board in June to go over potential projects and management actions, just to understand potential costs, and also to discuss whether or not that could move the needle a little bit on the proposed sustainable management criteria. Today we appreciate the opportunity to talk with your board about this and hear your board's input on this topic. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to you, President Atkins, for discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Vergoots. And thank you, Jeff. That was a tremendous presentation. Pretty much a fire hose of information again,
Yes.
but there's no way to approach it, in my opinion. Frankly, I'm blessed to have been involved in water for 16 years and could follow everything. And some of us on this call, it's possible they didn't, but my guess is everybody followed right along with you, because that was really tremendous. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to open it to questions from the board. Go ahead. Any hands raised, Uni?
Yes, Director Martin, and then Director Goodside after.
Okay, let's go with Mr. Martin. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, President Atkins. This is a question for Rick and for Jeff, I suppose. you've used the expression recoverability, I think would be the right word, of groundwater over the planning period out to 2042. And my question is, how do you determine or judge recoverability? Is it based on historical levels, historical data, or is there an analytical effort made to judge or determine recoverability?
Yeah, I think I was more focused on the basin recovering from droughts. Let me ask a clarifying question, Director Martin. When recoverability, are you thinking about amount of water that can be recovered, or are you thinking about water levels?
Well, water levels would be the measure, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Jeff, could you speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah, sure I can. This is really fundamental to this whole plan is what do we think is going to occur in the future with full build out, full use of the operating plan up to its maximum during drought periods and adding climate change. And when we say recoverable water levels recover, we've used the groundwater model as a tool. We've calibrated the model to measure historical water levels all over the basin, both in the alluvial aquifer and in the Saugus and in the river, flow in the river. So the tool we have replicates the historical pattern very well. And then and that's called calibration, when we compare the predicted water levels with the model to historical measured water levels. So we've got a well-calibrated model. And then we use that model to go forward in time to impose different conditions, like climate change on top, where we have reduced precip, we have more evapotranspiration, and we have more pumping. And we look to see when during dry periods, we see the water levels drop, but when the rainfall returns, as we see fluctuates normally, when rainfall returns, we get normal or above normal conditions, and then drought again. Do those water levels come back, and are they roughly what they were before? And that's what I think the term recoverability means. And we use this model to help us determine whether we're in balance or not. It just means that, okay, we've got enough rainfall recharge and stream flow percolation to be able to sustain the amount of pumping that we're doing in the basin.
Okay, so let me just follow up. So what you're saying with the projected hydrology and your model projected out to 2042, water levels, even if they decline, will recover to historical levels during that period.
Yes, or they'll recover to a point where they don't continue to just drop off from year to year to year. That's unsustainable. That's not recovery. That means we're pumping more than what is naturally recharging.
Okay. Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate that.
Yeah, sure.
Director Gutzeit.
Thank you. And I did get to go to the at least one of the GDE presentations, which was really good and helpful to understand some of this. A few comments, and later on I started to write down which slide it was, but at the beginning I failed to do that. So on the goal statement, again, I would welcome punctuation and a shorter sentence, as I do with most things. I think it's for something that is going to be repeated and understood by the public. We should go for simplicity, and if we need multiple points in there, it can be more than one sentence. Is my comment on the goal.
Great.
Similarly, on slide 8. You had the qualitative goal, which might be a vision or something like that in strategic planning, and then quantitative goals. Again, if this ever comes up again, I think it might be helpful for people to think of things perhaps as a vision and then goals, or targets or something like that, but to have a general goal and then other goals might confuse people. It confused me a little bit. And then going into a bunch of slides, I noticed a trend. Sometimes there were comments about things caused by pumping, and this came up in the GDE discussion as well. Am I correct to understand that the goal of this plan is to look for problems caused by pumping? Okay, I see Jeff nodding his head, because there's some in there that may happen without the pumping or without the influence of pumping. For instance, groundwater monitoring at private wells, some of those can be poorly constructed. Some of those can have localized impacts and are, of course, not monitored like the municipal wells are. So I think in the final plan, we want to be, repetitive and really clear that if it's caused by pumping, we will react. If somebody's well goes down for E. coli contamination, nitrate problems up in some side canyon, it is not the GSP's job to fix that. We may catch it because it sounds like we'll be encouraging some additional groundwater monitoring there, but I just want to make sure our line is clear on this, because a lot of things can happen in a lot of different areas and not just because of pumping. I know Jeff mentioned tectonic causes, oil and gas, might be a problem, and some subsidence. So I just want to be really clear on every single impact that if it's caused by pumping, we'll do something. If it's not, we can alert people to an issue, but it's not an action that we're going to take to fix it. Trying to summarize that. That just came up on a lot of slides, so I had a lot of notes on that. Slide 40. You had GDE, decreases in groundwater levels affecting GDEs. Will that have a number of years added to it like the other groundwater levels? Because I didn't see a 2 or 3 year. It will? Okay.
No. I think that's a good comment. That's a good question.
Okay. Yeah, I mean,
So-
if it makes sense in the other places, it might be shorter for the GDEs, although we have that enhanced monitoring. I don't know, for consideration. I think clarity now is going to help us later. Even if it's 1 year, if it's half a year, but we should know what that is, especially if we have years on the other levels.
Yeah, I think
Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just thinking the logic that we had assumed here was that if we see water levels dropping below historical levels that have ever been seen by the plant community, that could create an impact within months.
Right, yeah.
And so we didn't want to have a time frame that extended to years. Well, we'll wait next summer or the summer after.
Well, and then maybe we spell it out. 3 months of down is cause for alarm. Slide 43, and see, I did go to the GDE session, but remind me why you have riparian coast live oak habitats, those orange areas on your GDE map, but they're not being monitored. Are they not? Is it riparian habitat, but not a GDE for the coast live oak areas?
Another good question.
Yep.
So when we first started, we had a map of potential GDEs. That was a report that Tom Barnes with GSA put together. And we had plants that are normally associated with groundwater as mapped by the state all over the basin. That included live oak, included upland areas, included side canyons, included a number of locations that were outside of where there could likely be groundwater. The issue in some of these locations like the ones you saw there. So we're not sure.
Okay.
There's a possibility that those areas are supported by springs or seeps or perched water.
Mhm.
And it's outside of the main corridor, as you could see. I'm thinking that where we're going to end up on those, if we couldn't for sure eliminate them, we'll probably put them in another category of possible GDE, just because we don't have the information to formally eliminate it. But we are planning to look at that more closely.
Okay, yeah, no, that's great. I was confused why they were on there, but that makes sense. You know, if it's a potential GDE or needs more study, then people won't think they're being completely neglected because they don't have their own monitoring points.
Right.
Yeah, no, it was a great presentation. Thank you very much. And thank you for answering my questions.
Thank you.
Any other hands raised, Uni?
Yes, Vice President Natoli, followed by Director Cooper.
Go ahead, Ms. Natoli.
Thank you. Perhaps I will defer right now to Director Cooper because I probably have 8 or 9 questions or comments, and I'm not sure how much longer we want the meeting to go on, or and Director Cooper may ask a couple of the questions that I have, as Director Gutzeit has already asked a couple of the questions that I had. So right now I defer to Director Cooper.
I appreciate that. Before you start, Mr. Cooper, I think the board members ought to have the ability to contact Mr. Vergoots if it's something that they're just doing for their own edification that might make better sense rather than tie up the board. So I appreciate your deference, Mr. Tolley. Go ahead, Mr. Cooper.
Well, thank you. And excellent presentation and just a wealth of knowledge there. I can imagine that the stakeholder committee was as overwhelmed as we are. And most of my questions were answered by both Director Martin and Director Gutzeit. These are moving targets, are they not? Once you establish these thresholds, they're not there forever. Right? Is that as time goes on and climate change has more effect on us, those thresholds can be adjusted to meet whatever the needs are at that. Is that correct?
That's right.
That's correct.
Okay.
And there's a
and in either direction, they may go up, they may go down.
Mhm.
Yeah, and we'll have a monitoring program with the GSP, and it's going to identify where we have data gaps, where we want to close those data gaps. And yeah, over time, I see those thresholds as tightening up and becoming more responsive.
Yeah, I do too. Very good. Thank you.
Every
Excellent
5 years,
presentation. I appreciate it.
thank you. Thank you very much. Every 5 years, DWR requires that the GSP be updated, and that seems to be a logical time when these thresholds would be reevaluated. But you know, the GSA could take it up sooner than that if you wanted to.
Any other hands raised? Uni?
Not among the directors, unless Vice President Natoli wishes to go next.
Thank you, Secretary Kang. I just have a comment and then perhaps a suggestion. My comment first is, I believe that any question that I may ask during the board meeting would not be just for my own edification. I'm sure that there are many people who would have the same question that I do, and you never know. I may actually ask a question that can improve the GSP. So I wouldn't assume that my questions would be just for my edification. A proposal, because the meeting has gone quite a while, I do have what I consider are some substantive questions, but what I would be willing to do, given the length of the meeting right now, is to submit these in writing. Perhaps the staff could answer those, and those could also be posted online for everyone to see, just so everyone is aware of the questions that I had, and the public is also aware of the answers, as well as the directors could be made aware of the answers. So that would be a suggestion I have, because you know, I could take another half hour or 45 minutes. So I don't want us to sit around for that because we're already at almost 2 hours for the meeting.
I appreciate that. Thank you. I didn't mean to infer that you would ask those types of questions, but I think we'll take that up as a terrific suggestion. I have some questions that I'm going to defer and put them in writing. And I would suggest all the board members do that, but we are obligated to take this to the public. So I'm going to ask if there are any public comments on this section.
We do have one public comment coming. Hold on one second. Go ahead, Ms. Faulkner.
Thanks. That'd be me again. Sorry. Back somewhere around slide 18, the comment was made that there was more water in the river than there ever has been. And I'm just wondering what the time frame is that you're measuring that from. Is it this year? Is it this year and last year? Is it the last 5 years? Is it 10 years? What's the time frame of that? And then my next question is, or a comment maybe, is perhaps that because 40% of the wells are closed, that maybe there's not as much pumping going on, and that's causing the river levels to be higher than they have been in the past. And then my last comment is for you, Rick. High five back at you. High five.
Thanks, Stacy.
And yeah, so those are my questions. And I will give you back your 2 minutes. I'm doing well today.
Thank you.
Jeff,
Go
I'll
ahead,
talk
Mr.
about
You're welcome.
the slide that talked about more water in the basin. That's been something that's been trending upward for decades, and it started with urbanization and imported water. Prior to imported water, there was more agricultural pumping in the western part of the basin. Over time, urbanization took hold. Agricultural water use went down. We began to import water, and we had water treatment plants that went on board that were discharging to the river. And so those factors, bringing in imported water, putting water in the river, has caused additional water to be in the basin, and that's from urbanization.
Okay, thank you. Any other public comments, Uni?
Looks like Ms. Faulkner has her hand up again.
Okay, let's give you a minute so you can take up the rest of your 3 minutes, please.
Sorry,
Go
I
ahead.
just had one last question that I forgot to ask, and it was around subsidence. Early on, when I first brought this up, I was told that we didn't have the same soil type that they had in the Central Valley, and that was why we didn't see areas of subsidence. And so I'm wondering now where you're going to be measuring for the subsidence, and is this a change? Is this something that has changed over the last couple of months? Because I know that we talked about this before. So just curious.
Jeff, you want to take that?
Sure thing. The subsidence issue is something we've been looking at actually for quite a while. Initially, we were relying a lot on the satellite imagery that showed very little, if any, subsidence. In fact, some locations have risen, and land surface has risen. But we decided that we wanted to take a closer look at it because we knew that groundwater levels could be lower than what they have been historically. So we dug into the records, and it turns out LA County has some longer term records for subsidence in the basin at a number of benchmark stations. I have personally not seen where these stations are, but we did have a conversation with Eddie Petch from DWR today, actually, on this topic, to make sure that we understood what it was that they expected on this topic. And bottom line is that as in many basins, we just don't have enough information to help us evaluate this criterion. It's not like we're sitting in the Central Valley where they've had years of subsidence monitoring. We just don't have it. So what basically Mr. Petch said was that we want you to present to us what information you have, what you know, what you don't know, and what you based on the geologic setting in your basin, what do you think is going to happen? And then we suggested, well, we have uncertainties. We have a data gap here. We don't know. So what we're likely going to end up with is proposing some monitoring at certain locations. And the locations that we're going to choose are going to be some of the locations that LA County's been monitoring every 5 or 6 years. We may choose to monitor it every year, for example, more frequently. But we'll pick the same benchmarks, we'll pick the same datum, so we have a constant elevation we're both measuring in the future. And Mr. Petch said that he thought that was reasonable to go with. And if we need more stations in the future, or the idea being you put these stations where you have critical infrastructure, where the State Water Project pipeline comes through, or you've got a water treatment plant, or you've got some other sensitive land features, roads, et cetera, that would be subject to subsidence, and you would pick locations in the areas where you expect the largest water level changes in the groundwater system when you pump, i.e. the center part of the basin.
Makes sense. Thank you. Any other public comment, Uni?
Yes, it looks like there's one more.
Please announce yourself.
Give me 1 second. Go ahead with your public comment.
Hi, my name is Ruby. I have a question regarding GDEs. When you say a higher intermediate trigger is being, quote, considered right now, can you please share what is being considered exactly to determine whether a higher trigger should be established? Thank you.
Sure, I can speak to that, Ruby.
Hang on a second, Mr. Vigors. Ruby, is that the only question you have, or are there others?
Thank you.
Oh, that's my only question. Thanks.
Okay, good. Then we are going to move to Mr. Vigors. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, President Atkins. Yeah, Ruby, initially when we released the approach for the GDE trigger levels, we keyed those in at the lowest historic water level. But based on a comment, and it may have been from you, about are those high enough to allow an evaluation to take place and a response to take place? And we thought about it, and we thought, no, we're going to raise them. And so we've raised them near the I-5 bridge a couple feet. Jeff, I don't know if we've raised them in other areas, but we're going to continue to look at whether or not they should come up more, because the bottom line is time. If the water levels are trending downward, and it looks like we've got a pumping induced downward trend, and there could be the potential for undesirable results, we're going to need time to respond. So those trigger levels will reflect the necessary amount of time to evaluate it.
I would add, Rick, the other consideration is how sensitive the area is.
Thank you, Jeff.
At the I-5 bridge, we know we have sensitive aquatic species that cannot tolerate a loss of flow in the river or water levels that drop too low. So we needed to make sure that we had adequate time to respond if we start seeing water levels or flow dropping to a point of concern. So that's why we set what we're calling initial trigger levels above the historic low in those locations. And we're thinking about it, frankly, doing the same thing in the other monitoring locations that we have, even though we don't think that the groundwater dependent ecosystem species are sensitive in those locations.
Okay. Any further public comment, Uni? Are we good?
It looks like there are no more further comments.
Okay, with nothing further from the board, we're going to move on to 3.4. Unless any of the other board members would like to move on to 3.5, I'd like to take up 3.4, but we are getting along. We're getting kind of long in the tooth on this meeting. Hearing no objection, we'll go ahead then with 3.4. I don't have directive on my agenda, so I'm going to handle this one. All the board members were sent, unless somebody wants to chime in. Okay, all the board members were sent
Director Atkins,
Go ahead, Mr. Cole.
I don't think, are you on the right agenda?
I think we're
Maybe
off
I'm not.
one.
Yeah, we have another board meeting. That's probably what you're probably reviewing the future agenda items. So this was actually.
Sorry. Good. So that's it.
Yeah, we do have another, the regular scheduled GSA board meeting coming up in, I think, about a week and a half. We didn't want to throw this on
Got
that
it.
because
I'm sorry.
so much
I'm
information.
looking at the. Well, all right. Well, we'll move on then. That means that the agenda called, what is there a 3.4, I guess is the question.
There's a 4 on today's agenda, which is consideration of future agenda items. And Uni, if I goof this up, Uni, I know you'll jump in, but yeah, item 4 is consideration of possible future agenda items. And then we have an item 5, which is adjournment.
Okay, thank you. Are there any future agenda items from the board?
And we can take that up at a regular board meeting.
Okay, thank you.
And
with nothing further then.
Mr. President,
go ahead.
I just want to welcome Council Member Gibbs. I see he's not on visually, but I can see that he's on here now, and welcome him to the GSA. There he is.
Oh, Director Cooper, thank you very much, sir.
Good to see you.
You as well.
All right.
And welcome,
Mr. Gibbs.
Welcome to the fun committee, to the fun board.
Yeah. And we're willing to help because there was a lot of technical information shared. You probably picked up on some of that. We're willing to help and provide, some of the local color, so to speak, if you'd like. So with nothing further, I think we're set for adjournment. Hearing nothing further, then we stand adjourned. Thank you very much. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.